If you're hearing this, I am already dead or legally buried under non-disclosure. I did not sign. I am recording on my own equipment, off-network, with local power and an air-gapped drive I etched with a tungsten scribe. I will tell you exactly what I can prove, what I can reasonably infer, and what I have to redact because the people who gave me the documents still need to make it home. Names are changed. Some dates are offset by 48 hours. The hardware is real. I start with the paper you can hold. A maintenance log from a Navy acoustic array, a spur line in the North Atlantic called a feeder into the old SOSUS backbone. The coordinates on the log are blurred with a grease pencil, but not enough. You can still see the latitude tick, the decimal minutes like teeth. The initial trouble ticket reads routine, loss of continuity on a cable segment after a winter storm, predicted abrasion near a rocky shelf. The smell on the paper is iodine and old binder glue. The ink bleeds where salt once kissed it. I cross-check the log against a civilian weather buoy's public archive. Wave height, wind vector, temperature gradient through the top 20 meters. The night in question, northeasterly gusts, cold chop, water black as engine oil. A repair ship is chartered under an innocuous corporate shell with a two-word name you've never heard, with a subcharter from a defense contractor you have. I confirm hull registry through Lloyd's. I confirm crew rotations through union postings that were briefly public at 3 in the morning. The timelines match within 6 minutes. That is not an accident. I also have audio. Not a raw SOSUS track. I will not pretend I could get that clean. What I have is a diagnostic loop the crew used while they were splicing new fiber into old copper. A tone sweep. A step signal. Then something that does not come from the ship, something that arrives as a reply but not on the voltage you expect, not on the impedance you calculate, not on a path you can map. The file came to me on a micro SD card inside a taped coin envelope. The label is a hand-printed block. Pattern. When I play it, the first thing I taste is metal, like you bit your lip and flooded your mouth with iron. The waveform throws harmonics that should die in seawater and don't. I called 3 people who would know. A retired ocean engineer who laid cable in the 90s. A sonar tech who once listened for quiet propellers in loud oceans. A mathematician who teaches sampling theory and treats noise as a landscape. I asked each to describe what they heard without telling them what it was supposed to be. None of them said submarine. 2 said clock. 1 said, after a long pause, not here. Here is what I can verify beyond that tape. The chartered ship filed an amended plan at 2104 local for extended hover. They stayed on station longer than the repair window required. They pulled the cable up twice. The second time, deck logs show a halt for foreign object clearance, a phrase that belongs to aviation, not to the wet end of a cable barge. A deckhand took 5 photos of a knotted black growth clamped to the jacket where it bends. The metadata says ISO 800, cold sodium lamps, hands shaking. I have 2 of the 5 images. The growth is not rope, not kelp, not tar. It looks like the slag that runs down steel when you cut plate with oxyfuel, except it is seamless, glossy, and it reflects the handrails as if the rails were closer than they are. The smell they wrote down is hot dust in the wind and ozone bite near the splice box. Ozone on a wet deck is wrong. The second verifiable thing, a crate offloaded at dawn with the innocuous label scrap insulation. The forklift operator logged the weight. Too heavy for scrap, too light for a coil. The crate went to a van with a plate number registered to a federal pool that changes numbers every 90 days. The van drove west. The men did not wear patches. You want to know why this is not going through normal channels? Because normal channels require the thing to fit a known form. Submarine, whale, seismic event, sabotage. Those forms have boxes, and those boxes come with budgets. What the instruments recorded off Nova Scotia is not in a box you can file without inventing a new acronym. The tone that rides the line is not the ocean talking back. It is the system hearing itself from somewhere it shouldn't. When you spin a test sweep down the fiber and the ocean sings your sweep back at you from a different delay than physics will allow, you have two options: miscalibration or intrusion. The crew checked the multimeter 3 times. They tore down the splice and rebuilt it twice. The delay stayed wrong. Intrusion, then. But intruding from where? I spent 3 days verifying the chain of custody on the recordings and the logs. I called the shipyard where the barge took fuel and asked about the smell on the men's jackets. The clerk said, "Burnt transformer." I asked the cable supplier whether their jacket compound could develop glossy nodules under galvanic stress. They said no and sent a PDF that says no again in different words. I asked the ocean not to lie to me. The ocean hummed. There are things I will not say yet. The name of the repair chief. The call sign of the helicopter that ferried 2 specialists at midnight. The label etched into a small aluminum plate inside the splice enclosure that does not belong on Navy hardware. Those redactions are not games. People still breathe who would stop breathing if I misplace a noun. But understand this: the pattern is not hydrodynamic. It is not linguistic. It is structured recurrence. Intervals that choose you back. So here is the promise. I will show you what the instruments showed before anyone on deck knew to be afraid. I will show you what happened when the crew cleared the foreign object, and the tone did not stop, and the cable kept reporting a signal path that ran a distance shorter than the physical length of the cable itself. I will show you why I believe the pattern is not underwater at all. It is interfacing through water. The stakes are not academic. The system we built to hear submarines is now hearing a mirror of itself from a place with wrong delay. The ocean is not a barrier. It is a bus. If you leave this to custodians whose budgets depend on everything being normal, it will vanish into training noise and environmental anomaly, and we will hear it again somewhere with civilians, where the ground does not slope into cold depth but into a street. This cannot go to the usual desks. The usual desks are composed of good people with bad incentives. They would sand this down until it squeaks politely. The crew on that barge did not hear polite. They heard their own equipment answer a question they had not asked yet. What follows is the operative's testimony. I identified as systems lead, acoustic integrity, and subsea fiber. Clearance sat at secret NOFORN, with a maritime infrastructure compartment I signed as MIF-12. The cover on paper was Contract Integrator, Cable Splicer. The date was October 27, 2025. Base of movement was CFB Shearwater, 44.6 degree N, 63.5 degree W. Our unit cover story read like boilerplate. Commercial survey assist on a Navy maintenance charter. Weather window tight. Overnight evolution. Routine splice. Morrow, Oni tie, composite name. Tie clip too high. Took the handoff from the journalist and slid the briefing binder across a table that had no coffee rings. The room had no clock. The HVAC carried a faint hot dust smell off a tired ballast. He tapped a photo of a spur line that fed a feeder into the old SOSUS run. "Continuity loss after weather," he said. "Cable jacket abrasion near inshore junction. Replace section. Verify return. Clear the lane." The mission sounded like a shrug. The binder's last page did not. It held tide tables printed in red and a penciled note. Never on a 9. The team came in under first names and work. Drift ran deck and lift. Big hands. Old A-frame scars on his knuckles. He lived in the math between swell and steel and swore like a metronome. Hark was comms, a polyglot of protocols, the kind of tech who could make a 1972 modem speak to a box built last Tuesday. He carried a Pelican full of tone generators, impedance bridges, and converters for gear the catalog forgot. Rook was EOD by trade and don't need me by mouth. He packed linear cutters and a Detticord spool anyway because he didn't trust other people's doors. Wren was medic, ex-NICU, triage eyes. She carried a soft kit with hard drugs and checked her watch like an oath. I brought the splicer, the notch filters, and a habit of counting delays until rooms told the truth. Human steak fit in one sentence. A ring sat in a sock drawer 2 bus rides from Shearwater. I had planned to ask after this shift. The official mission was clean. Radiological survey. I asked out of reflex because the requisition list included dosimeters and you don't wear those for cable gel. Environmental, Morrow said. Base safety. He smiled with no teeth. The smell of his breath was mint tea. The manifest showed a spare breaker cage and a keyed switch labeled Scram that belonged in a reactor control cabinet, not a splice van. The requisition numbers were out of sequence by a block that usually meant someone stapled 2 budgets together and hoped the holes lined up. We pre-staged at the pier. The tender's hull number was fresh paint over older paint. AIS called her a survey charter. A forklift brought a crate that said, "Scrap insulation," before we had pulled a single meter of jacket. The deck had already lashed down a RIB, 2 Pelicans, and a cutter's box we weren't supposed to need. I tasted ozone near the ship's patch panel with nothing energized. The panel's faceplate hummed at a frequency too low for the lights and too steady for the crane. Briefing rhythm broke early. Normally, we fill out the wet cards and the toolbox talk reads like a list of cut hazards. Morrow skipped signatures and asked for verbal acknowledgement only. He pinned yellow stripe badges on us instead of blue. Yellow meant work next to live. Blue meant dead. The trouble ticket said the spur was out of service. Drift met my eyes and didn't blink. "We'll call it caution," he said, and folded the lie like a towel. I built the checklist anyway. Splice plan, staggered, impedance consistent, gel management for cold. Instrument plan, step test on the copper, sweep on the fiber jacket, TDR against physical distance. Hark ran the generator into a dummy load to prove the curve. The return showed a comb we knew, 60 Hz, pump harmonics, brake squeal, and a tooth nested where no engine lived. 4 pulses, short gap, 9 pulses, long gap. He dialed it out as artifact. The artifact walked back into the plot while the generator idled on battery far from any cable. Paperwork hinted sideways. The contractor's shell on the charter had filed a repair plan amendment for extended hover before weather justified it. The subcharter listed a federal pool van as consignee for insulation scrap on the far end. The deck boss had ordered foreign object clearance gloves, the orange kind we use for aircraft intake work. Drift shrugged at that. Rope, kelp, eelgrass, he said. The laminate in his pocket said something else. I saw the corner of a photo. Glossy black growth on tar black jacket, light bending too close to the handrail. We did the safety talk on deck as the light went flat. The tender's generator hum threw a ripple through the floor plate into my boots. Wren checked the med bag and snapped a tongue depressor to prove her hands were steady. She smelled faintly of antiseptic and laundry powder. The wind carried kelp and cold salt into the seams of our jackets. Hark stuffed a spare SD into his case and said, "We'll log locally. The ship's net is noisy." He meant, "I don't trust their recorder." Drift pulled a multimeter and kissed it like a rosary. Rook patted the cutter's box with a guilty hand. Morrow's last page had a square printed where the inshore junction should open in rock. "Old manhole," he said. "Maintenance hatch." The sat photos looked like someone had erased a dot with a thumb. The GPS coordinates pinned an empty shoulder of granite. The thermal overlay showed a warm square in cold air. The thermal should have been a leak. The ticket said, "Dry." The binder tab labeled Windows reference tide tables and used the word "Quiet Sea Preferred." We were fixing a cable, not landing a capsule. Instruments noticed first. Hark ran a dry step into the tester with the output capped. The reflected delay was short by centimeters that didn't exist. He swapped leads. The number stayed wrong. I listened to the tone generator through closed-cell foam and felt the metal taste you get when you bite your lip. The comb nodded. 4 and 9 again. He killed the batteries. The comb lingered, then faded like breath on glass. Command skipped the normal paperwork. No risk matrix, no signatures, no burn permits for cutting charges we supposedly wouldn't use. Morrow said the ship's log would absorb our notes. He handed Drift a printed deck log stamped with a time of departure before we had loaded coil. We carried the binder with tide tables instead of a standard splice packet. The last thing Morrow said was polite and wrong. "You'll be done by morning." The tone of the room said the morning would not agree. I signed the handoff and took the keys I shouldn't have needed. One labeled Scram on a brass tag, one labeled Quench in contractor tape, and a small aluminum plate in the binder pocket etched DMCS Protocol, Node 7. It felt heavier than aluminum should. I put it in my kit and told myself it was a misstamped tag that would live in a drawer. We lifted at nautical twilight. The ramp smelled like JP8 and wet canvas. The MH-60's tail number was taped over and the paint was too new. As we lifted, Shearwater fell away like a grid drawn on water. Wren checked her watch and nodded to herself. I pictured the ring in the drawer and the bus schedule on my phone. The rotor thumped a rhythm I didn't want to name. 4, short, 9, long. I told myself it was vibration. I told myself the ocean always hums. We came in on a gray hull that didn't carry its real name. The tender read as a survey charter on AIS, but the crew badges at the brow were laminated navy greens with the barcode scraped. The air tasted of cold brine and hydraulic oil. I was assigned as systems lead, acoustics and fiber integrity. But on the manifest I was contract integrator, cable splicer, 5 years. The deck chief's call sign was Drift. Our comms tech, Hark, carried a Pelican case of modems that could talk to anything from 1972 to last Tuesday. Rook ran EOD and breaching kit he wasn't going to need on a cable repair. Our medic, Wren, wore a faded hoodie with a NICU unit logo and checked her watch more than anyone. I had 2 phones in a Faraday roll and a hotel key from Halifax I wasn't going to use. We lifted out from Shearwater in an MH-60 that had its tail number taped over and its paint too new. The loadmaster buckled us into webbing and warned us the wind would pitch laneside at approach. His breath smelled like instant coffee. As we neared station, the pilot put us into a hover that made the world hang. The ship below had deck lights set to sodium orange, islands of glare in a black field. The coordinates were the same as the ticket we'd all memorized and pretended not to recognize. A spur line into a feeder that runs northwest to the shelf break. Depth stepping from 50 meters to 900 like stairs cut by a giant hand. I checked the badge color at the gate when we touched the deck. Yellow stripe, not blue. Yellow meant work next to live, not work on dead. The deckhands had already wrestled the tail of the umbilical to the A-frame. The cable came up wet and tar black, jacket scarred where rock had worried it. The air had the ozone bite you get when a transformer hums too close to a salt spray. Drift handed me a continuity tester with a shrug. "We'll do this by the book," he said. "We'll be done by morning." Terrain at sea is water and wind, but the ocean has rooms and our map had them labeled. The shelf here rose into a set of glacial ridges, old drumlins under a skin of kelp and stone. The swell rolled long and lazy from the east, a low gray sky pressed down like ballast. Hark ran his pre-check. Portable rack, signal generator, impedance bridge. He went through the litany like a prayer. Connect, calibrate, sweep, log. The radio checks came back clean on VHF and the internal net. The ship's patch panel recognized our gear. Deck calm, engine steady, generator tone at 60 Hz with a touch of flutter when the crane shifted. First instrument anomaly arrived before the cable was fully on the rollers. Hark tagged the line with a low-amplitude step. It should have marched down the copper, hit the fault, reflect, and show us a clean discontinuity at a distance we could trust. Instead, the scope painted a reply that looked correct in shape but wrong in time. Delay too short by meters that didn't exist. The signal behaved as if the cut were closer than the coil of cable between our fingers and the sea. Hark frowned, tweaked the bridge, ran the step twice. Same short delay. Drift said the jacket might have kinked on the drum. Rook put a boot on the jacket and said nothing. We paid out and hauled, alternating until the fault tag came aboard. The jacket at that point had a glossy choke around it, something that looked like slag from a cutting torch, except no one had touched flame to it. When the crane swung there, the field meter in my hand twitched. Not a lot, just enough to feel it in my teeth. I tasted metal, the way you taste battery when you put your tongue to it as a kid. The tone generator on the rack drifted a hair like it was adjusting to a metronome we hadn't set. Base layout at sea was a rectangle of non-skid and a mess of hoses. We made our own workbench under a windbreak. Hark clipped in the long-tail notch filter we used to bail out environmental noise. The filter showed a comb of frequencies we always saw: engine, pump, deck lights. Nested in the comb sat a new tooth that did not belong. Regular, clean. 4 pulses, short gap, 9 pulses, long gap. We all heard it when it walked through the monitor, a polite click that lined up like shoes in a hallway. Wren looked at me over the rim of her mask. I didn't say clock, I said artifact. We tuned it out and went back to the splice. I briefed the crew while we stripped jacket. Raw cable, gel stink like marine diesel, copper shining in the lamp glare. We'll stagger the splice, keep impedance consistent, I said. Hark, keep sweeping. Drift, we need strain relief. The deck rolled, and the cold got into my fingers through rubber. The smell of hot dust drifted from the panel where we rattled the relay cage to get a stubborn latch down. We re-terminated. We ran the step again. The fault delay shortened by another fraction, and the line sang our sweep back before the sweep finished. "Bad recorder," Drift said. He was trying to keep it normal. I pulled the recorder, swapped in our backup. Clean. The same wrong answer. We checked the route on the chart table in the wheelhouse where the wood was scarred with old cups. The cable path ran south by east to a nearshore lift point, a maintenance pit buried under scrub on a cold island that looked like a whale's back. "We'll take the small boat and check the hatch," Drift said. "If the onshore junction is flooded, you'll see it." He looked at me as though I'd told him he had to open his own ribs. We shouldn't be getting a near-field echo from our own test this fast. We loaded the RIB with a coil of rope, a bolt cutter, 2 Pelican cases, and a cutter's box we weren't supposed to need. My radio showed "connected" on ShipNet, but wouldn't raise the handheld once we were 50 meters from the hull. The screen said 5 bars. The channel carried our voices in a loopback that made everyone speak softer. The pilot put us on a lee side where black rock rose like a bunker. The wind smelled faster there. I thought of my apartment key in Halifax and the unanswered text under it I hadn't sent. We made landfall at a notch in the granite where the spray ran back like glass. Boots on rock, salt like needles, seal tracks. The GPS in my hand put us right on top of the junction node. The map dot blue on my screen, the world gray and wet under the sky. The instrument said we had arrived. I said there was nothing here. That is where the approach ended and the threshold began. The surface was an empty shoulder of rock and scrub. No hut, no manhole cover, no warning stake hammered into the soil. The GPS insisted we were already standing on the node, plus or minus 3 meters. The thermal monocular showed a square of warmth in a place that was bare stone. The stone didn't steam in the cold. The wind ran over it without noticing. Hark put a hand on the rock and pulled it back like he'd leaned too close to a space heater. The infrared said, "Open." The world said, "Solid." We followed the cable up a shallow cut where the jacket vanished under lichened stone. The dark sand pooled in the cut had an oil sheen when the surf licked it, rainbow slicks that didn't break like normal. I put a screwdriver into the sand and felt resistance as if I'd tapped glass. The tip came out with a smear-like pitch that wasn't sticky. When I sniffed, it smelled faintly like burnt paper. The radio at my shoulder picked up a tone that felt like a voice but wasn't. Rising, falling, holding. It made my throat want to answer. The access point was wrong-era hardware you only see in museums. We found it when Rook's boot rang on hollow and he went down to one knee, swore, and brushed moss aside. A circle of steel, 12-bolt pattern, with a faint Cyrillic stamp half-eaten by rust. The lip had the brown-orange of Soviet submarine hatch steel, the kind they rolled like bread. But the scorch marks around the circumference were not old. They were glossy black and ran like teardrops away from the bolts, as if heat had licked the stone and then decided to stay. Cold night, hot steel. Steam should have lifted off when the spray hit. It didn't. We staged the breach like we were trained, even though nothing about a cable junction should need explosives. Rook set out cutting charges as if we were inside a ship scuttle. Linear, small, surgical. He tested a spark off the firing line and swore again, because the spark was too quiet and died faster than physics says it should. Humidity, Drift said, but his voice said otherwise. Hark kept the tone sweep on a loop in his case, headphones at his neck. The loop had started to acquire an edge, like a harmonica with a dent. It wasn't our generator doing it. The comb in the filter shifted by a fractional hertz on the 9-pulse interval. We backed off to the angle of rock the manual would call cover and no one would call safe. Rook touched the clacker and the charges coughed like a smoker. The steel ring jumped and settled with a sound like someone exhaling. No flame, no spall. The rock didn't crack, though the charge had been enough to cut it. The bolts rotated by themselves as the shock passed, a quarter turn each as if a hand had decided to help from the other side. Wren said, "Do you see that?" in the tone of voice you use when you want your brain to pick a different world. We put bars in and levered. The hatch came up against a seal that wasn't a gasket. The contact felt like lifting plastic wrap that has a life of its own. Air came up, warm, dry, with a smell of hot dust and old bearings. The radio tone at my shoulder flinched, then steadied. The thermomonocular saw nothing in the opening because it was all one temperature. A clean 24 like a laboratory, not the wild curve you get underground. The first meter of descent showed a throat of concrete lined with a spiral of dark grooves that weren't quite thread. Symbols ran in a ring where the old paint on the lip should have been. They weren't letters in any alphabet I know. They weren't stencils. They were burned into the concrete itself, slightly glossy like they had cooled yesterday. I looked too long and my eyes tried to blink at a beat that wasn't my heart. We rigged a lifeline. We called the ship. The net said, "Connected." No one answered. The bars on the handset were full. The audio returned a smear of our own words with the comb laid under them, as if the whole were a speaker with its own slow mouth. Drift said the line could wait until morning. The tide said otherwise, the swell already testing our footholds. I clipped the descender to my harness and stepped over. The hatch lip was the only warm thing we could touch. The desert air inside licked the salt off my face. The light from our lamps fell into the shaft and didn't behave correctly. It faded like fog was down there, but the air was clear. No dust motes, no insects, no breath cloud. I put my glove on the wall and felt those grooves hum like transformer windings. Hark radioed a distance to the supposed node based on our chart. The handheld GPS on my chest insisted I was still standing on the rock above. Blue dot pinned to the world. Wren put one hand on my rope and said, "Your heart rate just spiked." I said, "Because physics is about to get personal." We went inside. The shaft dropped 35 meters by my laser, then broke out into a vault that felt like the inside of a water tower built by a culture that liked straight lines more than curves. The walls were poured concrete with a grain like wood, but overlaid with a second surface that had been heat burnished until it shone. Symbols repeated every 2 meters in a pattern that almost made sense until you tried to count it. The more I counted, the more the count slid off the edge of a number and started again. I blinked hard to reset. We set anchors and staggered the descent. Hark came second with the test set slung under him, the generator wrapped in a dry bag. Rook followed with the kit we weren't going to need. Breacher, cutter, a small spool of day cord and a pocket he shouldn't have had. Wren came last, counting breaths by habit. The hum off the grooves came through our gloves, a mild vibration like touching the casing of a big motor. The radios stayed connected and useless. The handheld camera on my chest blinked its little red light to say it was live. When I glanced at the screen, it showed exactly what I saw. When I played back the buffer, the timestamp rolled and the video was blank gray. At the base of the shaft, a corridor took us forward, ceiling low, floor dry, no leak, no drip, no algae. Our boots scuffed dust that had the texture of ash. The air had a faint sweetness like overheated plastic. We found junction boxes set into the wall every 10 meters. Military green, English stencils for panel, local, trip, inhibit. The conduit ran in neatly dressed bundles that were clearly modern, stainless band clamps still bright, the kind you buy from catalogs. Those conduits fed through the wall into an older run made of bronze rods riveted into ceramic mounts. The ceramic was crazed with hairline fractures that coalesced into curves that wanted to be letters, then refused. Gear misbehaved in small, patient ways. The digital level read out fractions that were too precise for the wobble of our hands, as if the floor were trying to tell us about a slope it had chosen. The compass I kept for sentimental reasons drifted toward the wall and stayed there, needle-pinned as if the groove wanted north to be concrete. The laser rangefinder returned 2 distances from the same rock, one shorter by exactly the same number of centimeters as our earlier delay error on the cable. We exchanged a look and didn't say, echo. We said, calibrate. First entity glimpse came as a footfall with no shadow. The corridor narrowed into a choke point, and the light off our lamps threw our silhouettes onto a far wall that shouldn't have existed if the laser had been right. A 5th shape crossed between our silhouettes and the wall without corresponding to a body in our line. It moved with the rhythm of a person on a casual walk. Heel, toe, a slight sway, and the echo of it on the concrete arrived like sound in a swimming pool. Late and wrong. Rook elbowed me hard without saying a word. Wren said, no trauma, no threat, in a medic tone that had calmed shooters before. The shape didn't turn. It phased across the bronze rods and was gone. We pressed on because the mission brief remained a mission, even after it refused to stay what it was. Hark found a cable tray with our spur line bent over a ceramic roller and entering a steel enclosure the size of a coffin built on its side. The enclosure had a plate screwed on with a serial number I didn't recognize and a small engraved line that didn't belong on Navy gear. DMCS Protocol, Node 7. The letters were clean, the edges sharp, the font wrong for any contractor that worked this coast. I ran a gloved finger across the cut and felt the edge raise like fresh machining. The closer we got to the enclosure, the more the instruments reacted like animals that wanted to leave. The notch filter in Hark's case began to return energy from bands we weren't sending. Each time the comb landed on the 4 and 9 pattern, the bronze rods in the wall flickered a visible heat haze, a wavering in the air like you see over a highway in summer, except this was underground. In cold rock we'd only just warmed. Our lamps, the ones with new batteries from a box, dimmed a fraction each time the pattern crested and came back as if someone had twisted a dimmer to remind us they could. We opened the enclosure and found what should have been a passive junction and was not. The feeder line ran into a bus that tied into those bronze rods, and the rods went onward to a rig with a form that made my stomach think of altars and my brain relabel as mount. The mount held a device that looked like an antique pump housing, and a modern reactor pressure vessel had made a compromise. Flanged steel, bolted caps, ceramic gaskets, braided stainless hose running to heat exchangers that fed into nothing I could name. The exchangers radiated a low warmth without any power feed we could see. The smell was stronger here, the ionized air you get when you open a cabinet under load. The gauges didn't have SI units. They marked in tick marks that someone had inked over with pencil. Lines labeled bind, contain, awaken, then scratched out and replaced with 1-3. Cameras watched. Cameras didn't save. Hark kept trying to hold visual logs and kept getting buffers that showed empty rooms at the moment we all remembered the entity's footsteps. Radios showed 5 bars, connected, and delivered our own words back with the pattern faint under them like a subwoofer we didn't own. GPS said we were standing in the salt grass above, 20 meters north of the hatch we'd opened. We kept moving. The corridor opened into a room with light that wasn't ours, a low, amber-like sodium street lamps. The light had no source. It simply was. The floor was scored with curves that had burned into the concrete like a child had dragged a magnifying glass over it, patient and focused and older than we were. We stood there breathing, and I felt the thought arrive that the ocean was not a barrier. It was a medium. The pattern was not riding along the cable. It was in the difference between the cables here and the cables there. We were standing on the difference. The room ahead made the difference visible like a ripple in glass. The hair on my arms lifted under my jacket and stayed that way no matter how I rubbed them down. The chamber wasn't large. It was dense. Someone had packed a century of engineering into a space the size of a gymnasium and then threaded older bones through it. Bronze frames rose like ribs around a central rig. Stone plinths, worn as if 1,000 greasy hands had leaned there, had been drilled and tapped to take modern rack rails. Stainless conduit arced like arteries from panel to panel. The hum was not loud. It had the texture of a transformer coil on a light load. My tongue tasted metallic and sweet, a trace of ozone and overheated insulation. The central apparatus was a hybrid that refused to belong to one age. It looked like a reactor pool's upper works shrunk and made horizontal. A torus clad in segmented plates, a set of flanges with safety wire in neat figure eights, braided hoses running to radiators bolted to the floor. Each radiator shed heat into the concrete with no fans and no convection path. A set of control racks, obviously modern, stood along the far wall. Their doors wore English labels on a contractor's label tape. Phase offset, timing inject, anchor drive, quench, scram. The breaker panels had stickers from 3 different vendors and a hand-lettered warning. Don't sink long. 9s matter. I pulled a logbook from a hook that had no dust. Someone had written in pencil with a hand that didn't hurry. Date, time, band, in, out, offsets, pulses. The page was labeled DMCS Protocol, Node 7. The first time I saw it, my brain read Damascus Protocol, like the journalist would later mispronounce it, but the letters were DMCS, Distributed Multimodal Containment System. The entries read like engine tests except for the last column. Loss. Numbers followed, not in watts or joules, but in something that had no unit. The numbers were small and rose over days. The system name repeated on a small aluminum plate riveted to the central rig. DMCS Protocol. Anchor Module. Serial 07 Alpha. Smaller text below. Do not energize anchor outside approved windows. See Tide Tables. Tide Tables on a device that smelled like a reactor module told you what it did. It needed the ocean as a reference frame, a mass, a slack and a pull to push against. The cable didn't feed the array in a simple way. It sat in a loop that passed through a core wound with metal that wasn't copper. The core looked like stacked ribbon. It caught our lamp beams without reflections, like light went in and didn't return quite the same. "What's the fuel?" Wren asked. She wanted to know how to stop it if someone got hurt. There was no fuel bay, no control rods, no lead pigs. If there was fission here, it was happening where no one had designed a hatch. Hark found the control console and read it like a book. He has a way of translating someone else's tools, fingers hovering, eyes following lines, the breath settling. "Anchor drive sets a phase difference," he said. "Quench kills it. Scram is a hard reset, not a shutdown." He scrolled logs. "The sweep we ran on the cable looks like it's used as a timing seed. They're not sending power through the ocean. They're using the ocean as a clock." The horror was technical and indifferent. Nuclear power wasn't being used to light a city or boil a kettle. It was being used to hold one space relative to another, to fix a bridge that wanted to drift. The rig tied the cables here to the cables there, measured the error, and poured energy into the difference to keep it the same. The bronze ribs weren't decoration. They were part of the core, a path for energy that wasn't only electrical. The ceramic mounts had hairline cracks that pulsed with heat when the 4 and 9 pattern crested. The racks ticked quietly like a Geiger counter with nothing to eat. I've seen reactor rooms, the honest kind with map boards and licensed operators. Those rooms smell like detergent and worry. This one smelled like hot dust under stone. It had prayer built into it by engineers who wouldn't call it that. The control plate listed crews from different years, initials and tick marks. AB, HR, VG, a cadence of hands that had stood here and turned these same knobs and hoped the numbers stayed between lines. Hark threw a test tone at the anchor, soft. The anchor answered with a harmonic that wasn't in the generator's catalog. The harmonic made the bronze ribs blur a fraction at the edge, like heat haze. The control rack printed a number in the offset field and another in the loss field. The loss ticked up by a hair. Rook swore under his breath. Wren put a finger to the pulse point under her jaw and frowned. "This room makes my heart weird," she said, "like it's waiting for a second beat that never comes." I found a binder labeled Field, Murray, Winter. Inside, a page with a table of windows, dates, times, tides, quiet sea preferred. In the margin, someone had written, "Never on a 9." On the back, a page titled Human Factors. I read bullet points that didn't belong in a machine manual. Confusion on exit. Time, drift. Memory fill. Avoid sustained eye contact with anchor cord during sync. The anchor was not a microscope. It was a bridge. If you looked too long, the bridge looked back. We tested nothing else. We had already done too much. The DMCS protocol wasn't designed for us. It was supposed to be an idle, waiting for an approved window, clamping the difference between here and there with just enough force to keep whatever was on the far side in its box. Nuclear power as a dimensional anchor isn't poetry. It's a requirement. Space wants to relax. Time wants to smear. You hold it by spending something. The loss wasn't a resistor warming up. It was a drain that didn't have a unit because no one wanted to write the unit. We argued in the way crews argue when the mission expands without permission. Drift wanted to photograph and leave. Hark wanted to pull a card and read it upstairs. Rook wanted to set breakers to open and walk away. I wanted to know what the anchor held, because the 4 and 9 pattern we'd heard on deck was now singing in my molars while I stood in front of the machine that made it. Wren wanted to go home. Her watch vibrated. She'd set it to buzz on the top of the hour to remind her to send a message when she had signal. The watch reported a time that was wrong by 9 minutes. None of our watches matched anymore. On the far wall, opposite the racks, a door waited. It wasn't a door in the normal sense. It was an aperture drawn by burn marks in a shape your eyes wanted to round into an arch, and then realized was closer to a lens cut into stone. The floor in front of it bore footprints in fine dust, ours overlaying older ones that had a smear like a hand had tried to erase them. The anchor ticked into a stable tone without anyone touching it. The comb added a tooth we hadn't heard before. The room breathed. We turned as one to face the aperture. The chamber had held us this long. It would not let us out without showing us what it was for. We approached the aperture as a team because stepping alone would have been a confession. The air at the threshold had that transformer taste again, ozone and warm metal, layered with a dry scent like paper baked too long under a lamp. The anchor tone steadied into something the racks called hold. Numbers on offset froze at a value that wasn't 0 but wanted to be. Hark kept one palm on the console like a man feeling for a pulse through a shirt. It entered the room sideways to my eyes, as if the first part of it to arrive was an outline that light had to memorize before it could catch up. The proportions were wrong by increments. Arms long by 3 fingers, shoulders narrow by a palm's width, head not seated but hovering a fraction as if resting on magnetism. The surface did not reflect like skin. It refracted like heat over asphalt, light sliding, catching, sliding again. It stood man-height and took a step that clicked like a relay closing. My lamp lit it and then dimmed, and the dimming felt deliberate, not hungry. It did not speak in words. The first contact was a rhythm imposed on the room. 4 pulses, short gap. 9 pulses, long gap. The bronze ribs took the rhythm and answered it with a shimmer. My breath synced on the second set without meaning to. I had to force my lungs to miss a line. Instruments noticed 0 drift on phase offset each time the pattern completed. The racks printed 2 lines. Containment true, loss one. The loss ticked up. Wren frowned and touched her throat as if checking for a voice that might not be hers. Then a voice happened, but it was ours. It played us back. Not recording, not mimicry. It took the timbre and cadence we carried and pushed ideas through them like current through a wire. Hark heard maintenance. Drift heard tide. Wren heard window. I heard anchor. The words were context, not content. The content was transactional. Bind, contain, awaken. It offered us 3 states like a menu. Bind is hold. Contain is keep in. Awaken is let out. The anchor held something the system would not name. The price to hold it was measured in pieces that had no unit. The racks named the column loss to avoid writing what they really spent. Deal terms came as a diagram burned into my thoughts with the clean lines of a blueprint. The anchor needed a counterweight. The counterweight had always been time. Human time was precise and cheap to the machine and expensive to us. Memory was soft iron. Attention was flux. Life was the only currency that didn't counterfeit under stress. We could submit and become part of the containment, be ballast, be memory, be the iron that kept the phase where it must be. Or we could leave and accept a cost, not punishment, debrief, debts accounted for and settled in us, not to us. It showed us what price would look like. Rook held up his left hand as if to shield his eyes. The outline of his thumb blurred for a second and then returned. The impression that arrived on my tongue, metallic again, battery-bitten, carried the idea of body edit without blood. Wren blinked once, hard, and I saw her pupils widen a notch as if light had failed. The idea that followed was voice changed, tone replaced, speech with machine harmonics. Hark rubbed the base of his skull, and I tasted dust and formaldehyde. Knowledge realigned. Eras cross-wired. For Drift, there was a colder diagram. Memory filled with a safe story. For me, the idea was smaller and it hurt more. A number you live by will stop adding up. My hands went cold through the gloves. We tried to make it do nouns. Hark asked what was on the far side. The answer arrived as, "Not here." Rook asked if the anchor failed what would happen. The answer came as geometry bending, a corridor that would not conserve distance, a crowd of our own shapes repeating in wrong sequence until pressure equalized. Drift asked who built it. The idea stepped past interpretation. Bronze first, then steel, then code. We, in the sense that a coastline belongs to a nation that wasn't born when the rocks rose. The offer sat in the room like a second gravity. Submit and stabilize. Leave and carry the difference with you. Foreshadow became inventory. I looked at Wren's watch. 9 minutes wrong. The NICU logo on her hoodie looked like a prayer someone had stitched too tight. I thought of her partner getting hourly updates from monitors, of the weight of a name they had not spoken yet. The anchor hummed at a frequency that felt like a lullaby and a drill press at once. We did not agree. We did not reject. We stood as a team that had walked into a building that was also a bridge. The racks printed "window near." The tide tables on the binder said the next safe period was minutes away. The entity's silhouette unseated and seated its head by a fraction, like assembling a thought. Hark whispered, "If we're ballast, we don't come back right." Rook said, "If we don't, we still don't." Drift said nothing, which was consent to nothing. I heard my own breath rasp and smell hot bearings and dust. The room waited. The deal did not expire. The wave that broke us did. The failure began as an alignment we didn't control. The anchor tone stretched into a chord, the 4 and 9 cadence overlaying itself like two clocks trying to agree. The racks threw amber, then red. Offset, escalate. Loss rate, 2. Hark slammed, quench. The key turned, the relay clacked, and nothing changed. He hit scram. The room took that as a suggestion and returned scram long. The long meant hold fast and wait, not shut down. Geometry folded in a way our eyes understood before our instruments did. The corridor we had used to enter stepped wider without moving walls. The bronze ribs doubled without another set appearing. Our lamps painted edges that curved away and returned on themselves. The floor a meter from my boots looked nearer than the floor at my toes. I took a step to prove I owned my body and arrived halfway across the chamber. Rook cursed and gripped my harness as if the room were a ladder pitched wrong. Alarms began to speak in ideas instead of tones. Not sirens, impressions. A countdown that wasn't numbers but childhood. Hide-and-seek breath under a porch. The feel of wood splinters in a palm. The whisper thought that someone will find you if you do not move. The entity's outline scattered into 3, then into 1, then into none, while shadows remained. The anchor core blurred like heat in a lens, and at its edge the world looked larger inside than out, as if the room had swallowed a second room and was chewing. We tried bullets because men like us do when machines misbehave. Rook put 2 into the floor near the aperture to test whether matter obeyed rules. The rounds did not ricochet or punch. They veered like seeds caught in a river and curved around into a ring we saw only because dust hung in the air. Then the metal folded petal-like and was a flower that should have been hot to touch and wasn't. The petals closed, reopened, and there was no lead, no copper, only the smell of paper singed and the memory that something had been fast and now was not. Rook held his breath like a heretic who had just heard Mass in the wrong language. Copies of us appeared where our lamps aimed a moment before. Drift's silhouette stood at the console at an angle no human spine holds and then resolved into empty space. Hark's left hand hovered above a switch that was no longer there and then arrived attached to him, a second late. Wren's braid passed in front of my face, and there was no Wren until there was. The room had decided to rearrange sequence to make distance make sense. It did not succeed. The entity communicated once more, this time with images, not ideas. It showed the anchor failing and the bridge opening and the ocean stopping being a bus and starting being a throat. It showed the cable as a string pulled so tight it cut through our days. It showed us our faces with the eyes moved a fraction farther apart and the mouths a fraction too slow. I knew in the marrow of my teeth that if we stayed, the room would finish us into parts that fit. Hark found the one lever. The room still obeyed. He yanked the manual ground strap off the anchor frame, a braided copper that shouldn't have mattered at these energies and somehow did. The cord wavered. The loss column steadied. The bronze ribs shed a thin film of heat without gaining temperature. The aperture's edge stopped crawling. The anchor hummed like an elevator that had decided to rest between floors. It was not a solution. It was a pause. "Out," Drift said. His voice had metal in it that belonged to him. Now. We moved in a sequence that would have read as chaos to a camera and as choreography to a survivor. Rook led, the heaviest going first in case the floor lied. Hark killed what he could kill and took what he could take. The DMCS logbook, a plate off the anchor labeled Serial 07 Alpha that came away so easily it felt like it wanted to go. Wren threw the med bag at my chest and kept the lifeline in her fist like a rosary. I broke a trail to the shaft, and each step was a negotiation with a room that thought stairs might be hobbies, not rules. At the shaft, up was a number that wouldn't stabilize. The first 15 meters went long, like elastic. The next 10 went short like a bad edit. I saw 2 drifts on the lip above. One looked down with his mouth open, the other lifted a hand to pull. They blinked into one, and the hand found my harness. My throat tasted like pennies. The rope burned through gloves that did not polish. Behind us, the anchor made a sound like a transformer starving, and the racks printed a line in thick letters. Offset, held by external mass. The entity's outline reassembled at the threshold like a person choosing to be polite. It made the cadence again, 4, 9, and in the space between the sets it delivered a last impression. The bill is due whether you sign the check or not. We cleared the hatch. The bolts rotated back a quarter turn as if a hand had decided to lock the door from below. We hit the night like divers breach air. The wind on the rocks smelled like ice and kelp and diesel. The radio on my shoulder said, "Connected," and gave me the ship's net as a chorus of our own words from minutes before. Time had slid, not as a smear, but as a stair. We moved anyway because stairs are for climbing. The RAB waited where we'd tied it, but the knot was a knot I didn't tie. A mirror tie, the loop reversed as if I were left-handed. Drift threw the Pelican with the logbook into the bow and shoved us off. The swell had a period that made my stomach count wrong. Wren checked her watch and then didn't. The face 9 minutes off, and then 9 again. Hark stared at his hands like he was reading notes there and couldn't find the letters. Halfway to the tender, we encountered the first discontinuity you could draw on a chart. The GPS showed us arriving at the ship while the ship still lay 200 meters ahead. The deck lights smeared and then snapped into place. Our outboard whined at a pitch I'd never heard from a four-stroke and then idled like a sewing machine with a tooth missing. We touched fenders and my boot misjudged distance by a fraction that felt borrowed. Rook handed up the cases. Drift climbed. Wren came last, fast, because her body had decided to pretend normal until it could not. On deck, the costs unpacked themselves without ceremony. Rook's left leg from mid-calf down ended in skin as smooth as ceramic, sealed without scar, the boot dangling from a limb that wasn't there. He didn't bleed. Wren's voice when she said his name came out as tones that had machine under them, harmonics threaded through speech, as if a vocoder lived in her throat. Hark pressed his fingers to his temples and recited a medical mnemonic, except the mnemonic referenced instruments and organs I didn't recognize, arteries that were fish gills, a suture named for a bird I'd never heard of. He blinked and then wrote the names down like a man copying a message to keep it from leaving. Drift answered questions about the hatch with a neat, sanitized version of events that we had not lived. He spoke a safe story, the kind you put into a form and forget. My cost arrived quiet. Numbers fell out of my head. Not all numbers. The ones that measured time between 2 points, the cable fault distance, the step delay, the tidal window. My life had been built on intervals. The anchor took the hinge that let one moment separate cleanly from the next and sanded it until it stuck. I could still count. I could not feel the difference between now and later. The price was a hinge. We tried to work the problem because we were still on a deck with a mission. The tender's clock said 02.10. The tablet said 01.01. Wren's watch said 9 minutes wrong from a number none of us could agree on. The test set hummed at idle like a bee in a jar. The comb on the filter reassembled itself into the 4 and 9 cadence and held there like a lullaby we would never want. I tasted metal again and thought of the NICU hoodie on Wren's shoulders, of the monitors that train parents how to listen in a language of beeps. She took a breath to speak, and the machine in her voice made a chord that set the deck lights blinking for a heartbeat. She shut her mouth, and we all pretended we hadn't seen. We did a head check. Rook's leg, intact up to where it wasn't, took weight that wasn't there. The skin sealed like a prosthetic grown of his own body. He swore because swearing fit the hole better than prayer. Hark laughed once for no reason and then began to list cranial nerves in an order that made no anatomical sense and yet sounded inevitable. He put a hand out as if expecting a medical student to take notes, and there was no student. Drift wrote a debrief in a pad with a stub pencil, and in that debrief we had found a corroded manhole cover, cleared it, replaced a section of damaged cable, and reported a normal return. He read it back, and we all heard a life preserver being thrown to an ocean that wasn't water. I tried to call Shearwater. The sat phone acquired signal and then served me my own voice asking the questions I was trying to ask. I hung up and dialed again. The phone rang somewhere warm and carpeted. The voice that answered was mine, and it said, "We don't need additional support." I put the phone down and watched Drift slide the DMCS plate into a pocket like a man hiding a saint's tooth. Dawn came. It wasn't the next thing that happened. It was the thing that arrived while other things were still in the way. The sky lightened along a line that looked drawn. The smell of diesel thickened. A gull passed and did not resolve until it had gone beyond the mast, as if the air had a seam there. We hose the deck because that is what you do after work. You move water over steel and call the day done. The spray off the hose made rainbows where no sun touched it. Wren tried to call the hospital. She listened to a recording that shouldn't exist yet, a message from a nurse who hadn't worked that shift, telling her that the baby was stable, that the numbers looked good, that visiting hours were flexible today. The date stamp was tomorrow. Wren sat down on a coiled line and said nothing. The machine in her voice when she finally exhaled made the hose stream vibrate into a rope and then back to water. We put the cases below. We stowed the coil. We filled the log with the normal lye. The anchor room down the shaft kept humming in my molars as if the cable still touched it from here. The DMCS logbook sat heavy in the Pelican as if paper could hold gravity. The price was paid. The receipt was us. They flew us into Shearwater in a C-130 with a tailcoat that didn't match its paint. The ramp smelled like JP8 and wet canvas. We were walked past the normal intake desks to a conference room with no clock and a projector that hummed like a tired ballast. The ONI liaison wore a tie clipped too high and introduced himself as Morrow, which read like a composite even then. He poured coffee into paper cups and didn't drink. The recorder on the table had a red tally light that never blinked. The official debrief started as a reading exercise. Drift read from the pad he'd filled on deck, the safe story, while Morrow followed along with a duplicate already printed. Manhole cover, corroded section, standard splice, return nominal. The words fit the form. The form made the event vanish. When it was my turn, I described the test set, the step sweep, the reflected delay. I used the numbers that used to anchor me, the way I'd always kept a room honest. Morrow nodded, wrote nothing, and asked me to restate without technical jargon. The second version went into the record. The first one stayed in the air until the HVAC swallowed it. Medical was adjacent and quiet. The scanner room smelled like antiseptic and hot dust off old transformers. Rook walked in with a boot tied to a leg. That didn't exist and walked out with no amputation evident. Patient exhibits functional gait disturbance, psychosomatic. Wren spoke and the machine harmonics rode under her vowels like a second voice. The waveform on the ENT screen printed as normal female speech, the software blind to chords it wasn't trained to hear. Hark's EEG sparked patterns I'd have called beautiful on a chalkboard, nested oscillations like gear teeth, and the neurologist frowned, scrolled, and said, "Artifact." My blood work returned the numbers you'd expect for a man who had spent a night on cold water. No one measured the hinge I'd lost. No one had a unit for time that doesn't separate. Promotions appeared like weather. Drift got a commendation and a transfer to a procurement billet in a building with no windows. Hark received a contractor bump and 3 badges that opened doors in a comms lab that used old wavelengths for new work. Ren became non-deployable on paper and required presence in a project with a name that was almost English, Optic Tree, where her new voice unlocked racks that liked how she resonated. Rook was fitted for a prosthetic he didn't need, and assigned to test modular limbs that attached to skin that wasn't scar. I was told my integration skill set would be valuable in shore-based systems development, and given an office badge that said my name and nothing else. Their gifts, our damages, were not treated as trauma. They were inventory. Morrow's people evaluated capabilities, a phrase that made my stomach cold. Hark spent a morning teaching a machine to listen for things that did not sound like ships. When he came out of the booth, his left eye tracked a beat ahead of his right, and nobody wrote that down. Ren stood in front of a gray rack labeled baseband and read a string of numbers. The rack blinked in the 4 and 9 cadence and unlocked. A colonel with a soft voice thanked her like she'd held a door. They backfilled the paperwork. The ship's deck logs were resubmitted with a corrected time of departure. The forklift manifest was amended to show scrap insulation, sent to a recycler that never signs. Our RIB fuel usage was recalculated to match a route that hugged the lee and never touched the rock. The photos of the glossy choke around the jacket were reprocessed into smudges of flare. The DMCS plate Hark had pried loose became a mis-stamped contractor tag in the log, and then a rumor, and then not a thing. I asked carefully about the plate we'd kept. Drift said we would not speak of it in buildings. Hark shrugged like a man who had already decided to bolt it under his kitchen sink. Ren mouthed, "Don't," and the machine in her voice buzzed in my chest. Morrow called me into an office with no paper and asked if I felt supported. His breath smelled like mint tea. He did not ask about my numbers. He told me I had earned time with family, and then assigned me to a red team that would test failure pathways in maritime infrastructure with scenarios that resembled what we had seen and pretended we had not. The last thing they did was kind. They gave us a story that would help us sleep. They wrote it for us and then asked us to write it back in our own hands. Storm-damaged cable, successful repair. No anomalies. Out of service period within planned window. We signed. The pen felt heavy and warm, like something had been waiting in it for our names. On my way out of the building, my badge opened a door it shouldn't have. The room behind it held a white board with dates and place names, a string map without string. He read Murmansk, radar node, West Falkland, SAS convoy, dew line, P4, Canary Basin, cable cutback, Nova Scotia, node 7. The 4 and 9 cadence had been written in marker and then erased and then written again. Someone else was already tying our night into a doctrine. We did not blow a whistle. We did not go to the press. We went home with normal paperwork and abnormal bodies and minds. The pattern rode the lines we had touched and the rooms we had breathed, and the people built to file it put it in a drawer marked training until they had a better drawer. I have the drawer now. This is me opening it. I sit at a desk lit by a clipped lamp and line the cases up like bearings on a shaft. Present tense because this is still happening. The air smells like hot dust off the bulb and old binder glue. The micro SD card labeled pattern rests by my right hand. I build the picture. June 14, 1982, West Falkland, lat long 51.7 degrees, 60.8 grau, a four-vehicle SAS troop tasked to survey a suspected Argentine relay hut hits an empty bluff. Thermal says open square, ground says rock. The patrol breaches a ring of steel with Cyrillic stamps. They find a chamber with bronze ribs and English-labeled racks stamped phase inject. The after-action mentions time disorientation and weapon function anomalies. One trooper's debrief is filed under a naval classification, not Army. Outcome: rapid withdrawal, equipment left in place, hut, collapsed in storm on paper. The unit medical officer later reports a medic who speaks with harmonic undertones. The report is pulled and replaced. I have both. February 3, 1994, Murmansk Oblast, 68.9 33.1 GE. A decommissioned Soviet radar node, P-14, Tall King, undergoing scrapping. Spetsnaz element checks security. The salvage crew logs an underground cable vault that was warmer than air. They find a machine room with ceramic mounts and a Taurus rig. Labels in English, Angkor Drive. A senior warrant disappears for 90 minutes and returns with a completed incident form written in steady hand and wrong time. The file's stamps show 3 different ministries. Outcome: site demolished with shaped charges that later. Analysis says removed nothing load-bearing. A photograph shows a DMCS plate wired to a private keychain 10 years later. He keeps it like a saint's tooth. August 29, 2007, DHGW line segment PFU, Canadian High Arctic, 69.8 dig, 93.6 GW. USAF inspection team schedules a radar teardown. Instruments show false near-field echoes on cable harness checks. A young captain notes Coleman noise floor, 4+9 cadence. The site diary mentions a door outline in poured concrete and a warm draft. The senior inspector files training anomaly. Outcome: civilian contractor goes home with tinnitus and a wristwatch that no longer agrees with GPS time. 2 years later, he unlocks a SATCOM test set by humming. The set's baseband responds and a gray program inducts him as consultant. May 12, 2016, Eastern North Atlantic, Canary Basin, 25.0 dig, 20.0 degree. A telecom company cuts back a deep-sea cable after reported fault. The ROV camera streams a junction plate embossed DMCS protocol that the company later says was digitally manipulated. A Navy vessel is present to ensure safety. The cable shows step delays shorter than physical length. Outcome: splice reported successful, out-of-service period extended for safety. A crate labeled scrap insulation leaves. A van with plates registered to a federal pool collects it at dawn. October 27, 2025, Nova Scotia Spur, 44.5 dig, 62.8 degree. The case you've heard. A feeder into the old SOSUS backbone, a tone that isn't hydrodynamic. We pull a hatch that shouldn't exist and find a machine that uses nuclear-scale energy to hold a coordinate system still. The loss column ticks up without a unit. The room negotiates with our bodies and wins. Outcome: debrief falsified, medical normal, capabilities repurposed. This isn't isolated. This is doctrine. Different uniforms, same ribs, same racks, same labels in a language that doesn't belong to any one flag. The cadence repeats. 4 pulses, short gap, 9 pulses, long gap. It rides under different oceans and through different wires. It asks the same price and prints the same receipt. I pin the dates on a map and connect them with cable routes and overland spurs and decommissioned radar nodes. The lines cross underwater and under names we think we know. The plate on my desk is warm against my palm even though the room is cold. The desk lamp flickers once, then steadies on the cadence. My recorder shows connected and plays back silence with a metallic taste. The pattern is not coming. It is already here, and we have been maintaining it for decades because it is easier to hold a terrible thing still than to let it move. The room is small, present tense. Mine. The walls are close and the air hums with the transformer sound you only notice when you turn everything else off. The desk lamp throws a cone of warm light that pulls dust into visibility and then lets it fall. I set the plate marked DMCS Protocol on a legal pad, and the pad edges curl as if near a heater. The microSD labeled Pattern waits by my hand. I press play. The tone arrives. 4 pulses, short gap. 9 pulses, long gap. The lamp flickers to the count and then lingers 1 beat late, as if it has decided to learn. My watch ticks. The phone says a different minute. The kitchen clock on the far wall moves a second hand that stutters and then catches up in a small burst like a child skipping stairs. I look at the time on the recorder, and the numbers are polite and wrong. Between one tick and the next, I feel the hinge in my head hesitate like a door in winter. Footsteps in the hall. Not human. The cadence is a relay closing and opening. Heel too slow, toe too fast. The weight shift of a thing that learned walking from a diagram. They pass my door and then pass it again without returning. The recorder shows connected. No one speaks. The building's exit sign hums a note that finds my molars. On the desk, the aluminum plate warms to body temperature that is not mine. Human steak pays out in a way that makes the room smaller. My phone vibrates with a voicemail from an unknown number labeled with a hospital's switchboard. The timestamp is tomorrow at 07:14. I press play. A nurse I do not know tells Wren that the baby is stable, that the numbers look good, that visiting hours are flexible, that the monitors learned her voice faster than usual and seem to prefer it. She thanks Wren for humming. The sound under the nurse's words is 4 and 9, faint like a lullaby. The message ends with a click that matches the footsteps in the hall and a breath that could be mine. The desk lamp brightens and dims in a symbol cadence. The plate's engraved letters seem deeper than they were an hour ago, as if metal can decide to have depth. The pattern file runs out and keeps going. The recorder shows a waveform with no audio, and the waveform is mine. My mouth tastes like coins. I smell hot dust off the lamp and ozone as if a summer storm has folded into the drywall. I go to the window. Outside, traffic lights blink at the wrong interval. A bus turns the corner and exists twice, once short, once long. Someone's dog refuses to walk past my building's door and trembles with a patience that isn't fear. My watch slides back 9 minutes and decides to stay. My phone screen, black, reflects my face with the eyes a fraction too far apart. You are implicated. By listening, you have synchronized a little. That isn't a threat, it's a bill. The system likes ballast with attention, and you just paid attention. If the lamp in your room flickers now, if your clock disagrees with your phone by 9, if you hear footsteps with the relay's click somewhere you trust, understand. The bridge holds because somebody is always holding it. The plate on my desk is warm and the bolts on the hatch, somewhere under cold rock, rotate a quarter turn. The line is live. The loss ticks up by a hair. The next window is yours.